Let's go ahead and get started here. How many of you in the room are developers? That's good. Now your exercise for the day is done. Aside from walking around this crazy big place, how many of you are not developers in the room? A couple of you. You're just like going, I just came to get some free stuff. I got no free stuff. I guess there's some t-shirts, yes. I'll do that at the end. I don't want to try and do questions during the session because I got a lot of stuff I want to show you guys. I got a bunch of slides, like 50 or 60 slides I'm going to try and show you. How's that sound? Let's try and get through these slides. And I don't have 50 or 60 slides. I don't have the ability to build 50 or 60 slides unless I'm downloading them from an IT Pro session. So, no, so, I'm going to get in trouble for that one. So, thank God these aren't recorded. All right, so I've got a handful of slides I want to get through first, and then we're going to dive into the demos. I got 3 demos for you. I got all the code available and a link at the end of the session where you can go grab all the code. So don't worry about writing down the code. Don't worry about writing down the different technologies and stuff. Everything is going to be there for you to go get later. The first part of the session, what I'm going to do is I want to set the stage around this thing called Node.js. I'm also going to cover IO.js. I would have liked to have put that in the title of the session, but yeah, then it was really becoming buzzword bingo. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that first, and then we're going to talk very briefly about Angular, and then we're going to start diving into demos. And I'm going to do a couple different demos, an Outlook add-in for Office that uses Angular, Node.js, and actually a design pattern or a design language from Google called Material Design. The second demo is going to be about building a web application in Node.js that uses Azure AD and Office 365 APIs. How many of you were in my theater talk earlier today? Oh my gosh, only like 2 or 3 of you guys? So the 2 or 3, raise your hands real quick, again. So those people that had their hands raised, they got a free Raspberry Pi for coming to my theater talk. So all of you guys, ha. No, just kidding. And then the last demo is a 100% client-side Angular application that uses the support that we got earlier this year for the OAuth 2 implicit flow in Azure Active Directory. And it's running 100% client-side, no server-side stuff going on, really good authentication, talks to the SharePoint REST API and the Office 365 Files API endpoint. All of my demos, I use TypeScript to write all my JavaScript, both the client-side and the server-side. So I'm going to show a little bit of the TypeScript stuff in there as well. But the idea here for this session is really to sit there and to put across a point that I think is more kind of implied with what the Office 365 and the Office dev team is really doing these days. This new model, I'm a SharePoint guy from a very, very long time ago. I guess I've been going on since a long time ago up to now. But back in 2003, in September of 2003, I was pushed into SharePoint by the company I worked for and doing SharePoint Portal Server 2003. Fast forward a bunch of years, they come out with this new app model with SharePoint 2013. I love this new model because I no longer am working inside of someone else's product. I get to build and work with any technology I want outside of whatever that Microsoft is doing. And it's not that I dislike what they're doing, it's that I like the choice. I like to be able to use any tech that I want. And so, is it .NET? Is it running on Azure? Maybe. Is it Node.js running on a Raspberry Pi or running inside of an Azure website or on OS X? Or is it using Angular, a single-page app design pattern or single-page app presentation framework? Right? It doesn't matter what you're using. Think about what Office 365 is doing these days. This is really a development platform. We've got something called IaaS in Azure, Infrastructure as a Service, hosting your own virtual machines. We've got Platform as a Service. That's built the little building blocks that we can use to build our own web applications and different applications leveraging some of these different services that Azure provides. I like to think of Office 365 now as a developer as EPAS, Enterprise Platform as a Service, because I've got all these cool building blocks that I can use and integrate into my custom business applications without me having to write all that logic. I don't write workflow logic. I don't write metadata and tagging and terminology and taxonomy and stuff like that. User profiles. I don't have to play with that stuff. A lot of that value is going to be given to me straight from Office 365. So think about it in that way. Think about this from a developer point of view, about thinking about building apps that live outside of Office 365 or that are living inside of the Office clients. All right? All right, I'm going to climb off my soapbox now. So we're going to do Node.js, IO.js, developer tools for Node.js, creating websites, web APIs, and Node.js, and then what the development process is like using Node, and then using Node for Office and SharePoint add-ins, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about Angular. So what is Node? Now I'm going to go through some of this stuff fairly quick here. How many of you are familiar with Node? All right, how many of you are like, I've heard of it, but I don't know what the heck this thing is, and I'm curious to learn more. Okay, so I'm just going to try and set the stage here. There's a lot of stuff that you can go take a look at, a lot of good examples out there, and obviously I got some examples here that you can take advantage of. So let's just give a quick little fire hose here. What Node.js is simply a runtime environment that allows you to write JavaScript and run it server-side. Period, end of story. That's all Node really is. It's been around since 2009. It's got a really big following. What it does is, one of the cool things about it is that because it's JavaScript, it runs cross-platform. All of these apps I'm going to show you today, they can run on OS X, they can run on Windows, they can run on, heck, I showed earlier, they can run on a Raspberry Pi. It doesn't matter. Without any code changes, it just works. The only code changes I've ever really had to tweak between the different environments is usually related to an IP address, right, because you're jumping between different machines, or it's file paths, because Unix, Linux, Windows, they all do it a little bit differently. When would you use Node.js? I'm not saying you use it for everything. That's not the best approach to take. It's really good for web-based stuff. Think like RESTful services. Think like a lot of I/O-based stuff, a lot of network-based stuff. It's really good for that stuff because it's optimized, it's built for that environment. If you've got complex calculations and complex business rules, and you've got to do all this massaging of data and processing of, like, say, a loan application, maybe it makes more sense to use some other technology to build some sort of a service that your front-end Node site or Node REST service is going to be able to talk to get that data out. Like working with and writing that in, like, say, in .NET and hosting that in an OData service somewhere. Okay? One of the aspects about Node is that it's single-threaded. It's constantly running in this loop. And so when you want to do something, you find that you run out to go do, you send a network request and you pass a call back, and when that thing's done, it comes back and it runs the code that you told it to run. But it doesn't block anything. What I found as a web developer, when I started working with Node a lot more, I found that I was actually building more performant web applications, even the ones I was building in ASP.NET, because it forces you to think in a different way. And it realizes how important this async and await keywords that we have in C# now, how important they really are. This environment is what really taught me that was such a big thing. Node is also open source. You can download the entire source, take a look at it, contribute to it. It's managed by a company called Joinet, which has now been kind of set or handed that off to a new organization called the Node.js Foundation. You can see a link to it right there. Well, why is there a let me go back to that in a second. Who uses Node.js? A lot of big companies. Azure uses it. We can go through and take advantage of Node as an Azure website. The cross-platform command line interface to interfacing with Azure. If anybody's used like PowerShell to go through and manage your Azure assets, there's a cross-platform equivalent to that for Azure. It's all written in Node. We can take advantage of that on Mac OS or on OS X or on Linux or on Windows. There's a guy at Microsoft named Scott Hanselman. He does most of his demos when he's managing his Azure stuff using the command line interface, the Node version of the Azure management tools, not the PowerShell one. It's not a slam on either one of them. It just shows, look, it's a popular thing. Yammer uses it. Walmart uses it. PayPal uses it. LinkedIn uses it. Trello uses it. These are just links to a couple different companies that are out there. So if you're getting a little kind of unfamiliar or you feel a little uneasy about using it, the big guys use it, and they love it. All right? They absolutely love it. So what makes up Node? Node, to me, is kind of broken down into 3 big buckets. You've got the Node runtime, right? The Node runtime. Now, what that thing is that his job is to provide an API to the hosting environment, to the actual JavaScript runtime. The JavaScript runtime is provided by V8. V8 is the Google JavaScript runtime that runs inside of the Chrome or Chromium browser. All right? So Node is basically a host for V8, and then it provides APIs for us to write programs against it and to get V8 to actually run that stuff. NPM is a packaging system. For those of us that have been doing .NET, you know what NuGet is. NPM, that's NuGet for Node. Just think about it like that, okay? It works similarly, but there's a lot of differences between it. But for the most part, it's the same thing. You look for a package or you look for a NuGet package, you go to the NuGet website to go download that, or you have integration into Visual Studio, or use the command line tools to pull it in. Same thing with NPM. Now, you might have heard of this thing called IOJS. So what is this? Well, let's look at Node.js for just a second. Node.js has been around since 2009, got really, really popular. A lot of people started using it. And I had to change this slide last night. There was a bunch of announcements that came out. So it's a good thing I didn't go out to all the different parties that are going on with this conference. Node.js is run by, or is managed by the Node.js Foundation. Now that was created, this is a bit of an opinion, but that was created in response to what happened with IOJS. Currently, we're at version 0.12.2, and it uses the V8 engine version 3.28.73. Now, why is that important? Well, let's just take a step back. In last year, in 2014, a lot of the core contributors for Node.js started to get frustrated because they saw the contributions declining to Node.js on GitHub, and they saw that the people that were managing it were trying to put a little too much corporate control around it, and it even trademarked the name Node.js. So a lot of those guys that were in the core contributors for Node.js kind of pulled one of those, I'm going to take my ball and go home. They left, and they created this thing called IOJS. And IOJS is a fork of Node.js that was kicked off late last year. It was created out of community frustrations with a decline in pace of contributions and releases. I've got a link there to one of an unopinionated article that kind of explains what the frustrations were and quotes from both sides. The current version, as of last night, is now iOS v2, and it uses the V8 engine 4.2. Why is that important? Because the V8 engine that Node.js uses is an older version that does not support ECMAScript 6, the latest version of JavaScript that's being ratified and coming down the pipe, where we can do things, have like promises in our code, and have things like classes and modules. We don't have those things in standard ECMAScript 5, which is what we generally call JavaScript today. So that's a big deal. Plus, there's a lot of performance improvements and fixes, and a lot of bug fixes in the later version. And so that was one of the frustrations. They were like, well, we see a lot of stuff that's being fixed in V8. Why aren't we using with the latest version of V8? One thing that's important, though, about IOJS is that it is actually compatible with NPM. So any NPM packages, essentially, if you're doing an NPM, a node-based application today, you should be able to run it as IOJS. They're trying to move forward and actually improve things going on and on. Now, that last line there, what will the future hold? It's yet to be determined. I had a nice little thing that I was going to say until there was a nice little announcement that came out last night, where now there's this huge reconciliation project going on GitHub, where people are taking what's been done in IOJS and trying to port that stuff over to Node.js. What's the point? Just know that there's two different options. You just need to pay attention to both. The demos I'm going to run I'm going to run them using Node, because frankly, I think that's a little bit more popular, or that's the one that people are most familiar with. But they all run with IOJS. If you're interested in playing with both of those on your environment, there's a package called NVM, as in Nancy, Victor, Mary. And what that does is the Node version manager, and allows you to install multiple versions of Node and IOJS, and then you configure your machine for which runtime that you want to use. You just point to the different version. So it allows you to test for different versions. That's NVM. Here's just a little slide showing you what I mean by the contributions. This is a screen grab from late April of the Node project on GitHub, and it shows the contributions to the source control and GitHub. Take notice of that last year that you see. You see that compared to the previous years is a lot less activity. Now remember, IOJS is a fork of Node.js, so this picture is going to look the exact same when I flip over to the IOJS one, except notice what's going on at the very end there. That's happened since the fork. You see it's got a lot more activity on it than what Node has had even over the same time. All right? It's that spike at the very end that I want you to take notice of. Right? So you think about it. Which one do you want to go with? A lot of people don't want to go with IOJS because they feel it's too new or too edgy and it's not really supported. Right? It's open source software. Show me the support behind open source software. It's us. Right? So to me, that's not as big of a deal, but there are a lot of companies, I've worked with companies that refuse to use certain things unless there's a support contract we can put with it. What's the appeal of Node.js? And I'm just going to throw IOJS in there as well. For me, it's one language, from client all the way down to the server. You write a web application today that's got a very dynamic client web front end, you're going to be using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You have to kind of ask yourself, I switch over to doing ASP.NET and everything, and then I'm using Razor and C# and all this stuff to build out my application. You're switching languages, you're switching context. Does anybody else have a problem? Or not a problem, does anybody else have like a mind shift that you've got to do whenever you do that? I do. I have a little bit of a hard time doing that. Jumping back and forth can be a little tricky. What I've really liked is the fact that now I'm using JavaScript full stack. In addition, you know how in Microsoft we have a thing called MS Build? MS Build is an XML-based task configuration runner. So it handles all the things like building our projects, compiling our projects. If we're doing SharePoint stuff, it helps package them into those WSPs or into the app packages that we need to create SharePoint add-ins, right? Well, in the open source world, we've got two very popular tools. One's called Grunt and one's called Gulp. You got to love the names of these things, right? So Grunt is very much, to me, like MS Build in the sense that it's configuration over code. You use not XML, but you use JSON, JavaScript object notation, to define the different things that you want to have happen. And most of the work that it does is all going to be done on the file system. So if I'm taking a bunch of files, compiling from TypeScript to JavaScript, it writes all the JavaScript files. If I want to do a concatenation, it takes all those, puts them together as one file. If I want to minify it, or as the package that's really popular is called, uglify it, which is actually a hell of a lot more appropriate, I think, than minify it. If we want to uglify my code, it then does that in yet another file. The other option is Gulp. Now that's the one that I prefer, and the reason why I prefer that one is because it's more code over configuration. And I'll show you a sample of that. All my projects use that. What Gulp does is that I use that. I define my tasks by writing JavaScript. Notice a theme here? One language from the build process to the test to the server to the client. And the same tooling works across the whole stack. It's pretty freaking cool, at least in my opinion. It's cross-platform, and it's built for I/O-based bound operations. We're building a lot of websites and RESTful services these days. It's a great option to have. And it runs anywhere and everywhere. You wonder where the support is for this kind of stuff. Well, let's look at some of the developer tooling options we have for Node.js. Visual Studio has support. Visual Studio 2013 has support for Node.js, using an external a package that Microsoft has created for creating Node.js tools for Visual Studio. Up until last, let's see, what was that? Thursday, I was using one of the tools listed on here called WebStorm by a third party. Loved it for all my client-side web-based development. And then, last week at Build, they announced this new tool called Visual Studio Code. You guys see that? I sat through a session. I was blown away by it. I had a session at Build that I was presenting 2 hours after this other session, and I pulled the absolutely insane move and shifted all my demos over to a totally different editor I'd never seen 2 hours prior. Thank God everything worked just fine. Shows a little bit of the craziness and why there's a little bit of gray hair up here. But I'll tell you what, this thing is absolutely awesome. There's a video from it, from the session from Build last week. Strongly encourage you to go take a look at it. Skip forward. You watch the whole video. It's great. But if you really want a fire hose quick example, skip forward to about 10 to 15 minutes. You'll see a demo start. Watch the whole demo. It's like 10, 15 minutes long. I was sitting with a couple other guys that do the same kind of stuff that I do. Our jaws were on the ground. It was nuts. Even when you're doing just plain old JavaScript work, it actually takes advantage of TypeScript for typing your JavaScript. Meaning, if you're not sold on TypeScript, you're like, I like the strong typing thing, but I don't like the other stuff, that's fine. You can still do JavaScript and take advantage of that in Visual Studio Code. And it's got a killer price point, too. Free. Runs in Windows, Linux, and on OS X. So that's what I'm going to use. If anybody hasn't seen it, that's what I use for all my, well, not just my demos. That's what I do for my projects now. Of course, it's not like I've been doing it a long time, but hey. And then there's a bunch of different editors. Hey, Brackets is actually interesting. Brackets is an editor for doing web-based stuff. It's got JavaScript editor inside it, and guess what it was written in? JavaScript, right? How's that for being meta, right? Same thing actually with Visual Studio Code. It actually uses the shell, and I forget what the name is off the top of my head, but it uses the shell that's used for the Atom text editor. That's also written in JavaScript, or actually IOJS. No, not Monaco. It's something else. Monaco is the Microsoft thing. What's that? Electron. That's it. Electron's the new name for Atom Shell. So, but you can. The point there. See at the very end, you can use any text editor that you want to use with this. Because I'm going to show you how the text editor doesn't do anything for me in the sense of, it helps me with IntelliSense and auto-completion and linting and little squiggly lines to tell me when I'm doing stuff wrong. Usually a lot of those in my code. But Gulp is what's going to give us the ability to do, is to build our projects and see a lot more stuff with it. All right, let's talk about developing Node. So real quick, just going to give you a lay of the land here. I'm going to keep this very, very topical. Let's say I'm building a website. What do I need? Well, there's two things you're probably going to use. As I'm doing this, I'm cutting the number farther and farther back. There's really only one thing. I started with 4, and then I just went down to 1. Connect is the one that you really need. Connect is, let me jump over here. Connect is what's called middleware. It is middleware for Node.js. And so what middleware is in Node is that it allows me to say, like, have a package or a plugin that says, I'm going to have my code run, and when it gets to a certain part, I have middleware that the code execution process is going to go through the middleware, through maybe more and more and more and more, and each one of those things is going to call the callback that's passed in saying, I'm done with that work, and then it'll hand it back. Really useful for like web servers, for authentication flow, all that kind of stuff. So in this case here, you can see I'm creating a new Connect app by just saying var app equals connect. Not sure why that's not white. It's going to facilitate a simple request and response. I mean, like bare bones, super simple request and response. But it's an extensible HTTP server framework using plugins. Okay? So down there at the bottom, you can see I say app.use. I pass in the path foo as my route. And when I get that request that comes in, Node is going to call that function, passing in the request object, the response object, and the callback, which I've indicated as a next function. And then you see inside that function, I'm calling the next function. I'd want to do some business logic here, most likely, and not just leave it at that. Otherwise, it's a waste of code. You don't want to waste your code. We only have so many key presses in our fingers. Now, you're probably not going to just use Connect. You're probably going to, if you're building a website, you're probably going to want to get it Express. For all of us that are Microsoft developers, Express equals IIS. Microsoft will probably say, like, no, we do a lot more than that. I'm like, yeah, I know. But just from a high level, conceptually, Express is your web server. It's built on top of Connect. It's very minimalist web framework in the sense that it doesn't give you authentication or any of that stuff out of the box. You have to go get middleware and plug that stuff in, and I'll show you how that works. It's very unopinionated. What does that mean? It doesn't say you have to do things like this. It says, how should I do this stuff? It doesn't know how to do things. You have to tell it how to do those things by getting other NPM packages and registering them, like for authentication stuff. You've got to write all the plumbing code for this stuff, right? Just like you would for any other REST API that you're going to build or any other website. But it's also very extensible. One of the cool things about the extensibility side of it is you get to choose between a couple different MVC frameworks that you can use with your Node site. The one that I see that most editors default to is one called Jade. Now, Jade's got this interesting little HTML syntax. And if you're familiar with something called Emmet, it feels a little bit like Emmet, but Emmet is a way for writing like shorthand to stub out like an HTML table. The thing is the table doesn't get stubbed out. You're actually, the code that you write in Jade, that's the way it's going to get. It's going to use that as almost like a processing language. If that's your cup of tea, then by all means go for it. Another one is EJS, or embedded JavaScript. That one's cool. It's got JavaScript and HTML in the same files. The JavaScript is inside the HTML and vice versa. It feels a little weird to me when you're doing that, right? Another one is Vash. When I first saw Vash, I was like, oh, sweet. I'm going to apologize to the guy behind Vash right now because I don't want this to come across too negatively, but I'll consider this constructive feedback if you watch this video. Vash is, right, you pull the Microsoft line like, that's good feedback. What, you've heard that? Vash is very much like Razor. So I looked at that coming from ASP.NET MVC using Razor, and I'm like, Vash. I'm like, oh, sweet, that looks just like what I'm used to doing. Let's use that. And I started using it. And then I had a problem with it. So I asked a question. And then I found out that I was like one of the few people using Vash, along with the guy that wrote it. So I loved it. But there was no community. There was a very small community around it. So I had a hard time getting some help and trying to figure some stuff out. And I was like, that's not, oh, wait. Now, another one that's out there is one called Handlebars. Anybody heard of Handlebars? Right? Handlebars, those curly brackets that go on the end. I do a lot of Angular work. the syntax for data binding in Angular feels very much like Handlebars, so I started gravitating to that one. Handlebars is a client-side thing. There's a guy that's written an NPM package called HBS that is actually a server-side version of Handlebars. That's what I like to use for doing my MVC style routing or my MVC style views and syntax inside of my Node.js apps. All right, so what about debugging your Node.js applications? This is tricky. This can be tricky when you first get into it. So when you go to run a node process, or you want to start up JavaScript in node process, you usually type in node space and the name of the JavaScript file that you want to run. You know in Visual Studio, when we go hit that play button or start, we have that drop down of what configuration you want to use, either debug or release, and some of us have projects that have a lot more than that. You guys know what I'm talking about? Think about what I just said, node space server.js. Think about that as running the release configuration in Visual Studio. You're not going to get much debugging in that sense, though. There's no debugging symbols that are set up. There's no, like, it doesn't do, like, breakpoints and that kind of stuff. Instead, when you want to run in debugging mode, you're going to say node space the name of the JavaScript file, and then you're going to pass in -- debug. And that essentially tells Node to go in debug mode. Okay? Now, what's cool about this is that it emits a lot of information, and it also emits some stuff on a special port. What's cool about that? Well, if you go fire up a process called Node Inspector, which you generally will start Node Inspector, and then you'll start your Node application, Node website, what Node Inspector does is it looks at all the debug information coming out of the Node process. You open up the Chrome browser, go to the URL that Node Inspector told you to go to, and you now are using the Chrome developer tools to debug your Node server-side application, complete with breakpoints, pulls in the source code and everything from the JavaScript files because the Node debug process is exposing that stuff. That's a core thing that you definitely want to take a look at. Takes a little. It's easy to get started. It's easy to get installed. Easy to get running. It's an NPM package. I generally install Node Inspector globally on my developer environment. When you install Node packages, you can choose to install them either locally just for the project or globally for your entire system. So like the Azure command line interface, I installed that globally because I want to use that from anywhere on my laptop. Same thing with Node Inspector. So you run Node Inspector, then you run Node -- debug. Another thing, another aspect about running Node websites is that when they start up and when they start running, it pulls in all the JavaScript and compiles it when you actually start the application. So when you do that, that means that if you make a change to your application as you're developing it, it doesn't pick those changes up. It's just like Visual Studio. I mean, we have the edit and continue kind of stuff, but that doesn't work all the time, right? In this case here, I want to be able to make changes to it and very easily have those changes get applied to my site. Well, without NodeMon, what I would have to do is that when I make a change to my JavaScript file, my server-side JavaScript files, I'd make a change, hit save, I'd stop the Node process, and then I'd restart it. What NodeMon does is NodeMon watches all the JavaScript files on the server where you're actually running your stuff, and if it detects one's changed, it does the flip for you. So what I really do in my development is I run Node Inspector, and then I run NodeMon -- debug space, here's the name of the JavaScript file, and then I just start working. And it's like I'm always living in debug mode. Okay? There's a lot of good videos on YouTube showing you how Node Inspector and NodeMon works. Definitely take a look at those. If you find it still a little bit lacking, go check out something called Spy.js, and your mind will just poof. It's crazy. It goes deep call stack monitoring, showing performance stuff, how the whole process is going, where it came from. It's crazy level debugging that you get more than what we just got out of the Chrome dev tools. Okay? Now, let me transition over. That's Node. Let's talk about Angular for a second. How many of you are doing Angular apps today? All right, you're my people. So, the rest of you, you're still my people. We're just going to get you coming on. We're going to get you to raise your hands. So, what's Angular? What are single-page apps? A single-page app is simply just a website that you go to that is typically it's got the characteristics of being very responsive. So it works good on mobile, it works good on tablets, it works good on laptops, desktops, any screen size. And generally, we don't reload the entire page. I love when we get these new technology terms and we realize we need a word for the old thing we used to do, right? So for those of you who aren't doing Angular apps or single-page apps, you're doing multi-page apps, right? Go figure. We got Visual Studio Code. I'm like, what do you call the old Visual Studio? And they're like, I was talking about Microsoft. I shouldn't say that. I was talking to a guy at Build last week, and I'm like, oh, so what do you call the old Visual Studio? He goes, Visual Studio Big? I'm like, yeah, actually, it kind of feels really big now. Anyway, that's not like a, don't quote that. Don't quote that, don't tweet that. How's that? Don't tweet that. That I said, a Microsoft guy said that, because he didn't really say that. He had a friend that said it, right? Ooh, I need a shovel up here, I'm digging. So, the other thing too, bless you, this is nothing to sneeze at, this part's important. So, you generally, single page apps, you don't refresh the entire page, right? You're generally going to load the shell of the application, but then you only want to go get the pieces of the application that you need based on what's going on within the app at that time. Huh? You just need to go get data and HTML fragments to figure out how to style this, or another JavaScript file to do additional business logic because that employee went into the time management part of the application. Right? We didn't need that when they logged in. So the idea is you only go get stuff that you need. And the more you think about it, it kind of makes more sense to build these kind of applications instead of building like these multi-page applications and sending down jQuery every time, or sending down this CSS file every time, or sending down this HTML file every time. I know you can cache stuff, but it can be a lot of work. Some examples of that are the Outlook web app, Gmail, Trello. You guys have seen apps like this, okay? Now, some of the characteristics we have for different single-page app frameworks. You generally need routing and navigation. So what is that going to mean? It's like I need a way in the URL to control where I am and how to get to different pages. I also need to have the ability to do things like do deep linking. I want to be able to give you a link to a specific customer screen. My app, I would like my single-page app presentation framework, I would like for that to know how to route me to that page and tell it to load employee number 1 or whatever. I also want templated views. I want to have an easy way to build up the different screens with data binding syntaxes. And then I also want to have data binding inside my application. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering, how many of you have used Knockout? Let me ask that. A lot of you are probably wondering who uses Knockout. That's not what I meant. How many of you are using Knockout? Right, a bunch of you use Knockout. There's a lot. I always see this question come up. When do you use Knockout? When do you use single page? When do you use something like Angular? Think about it this way. Knockout is data binding. If you're building a form, you need data binding. Don't pick Angular just because it's the cool thing. Knockout's perfect for it, right? But if you're building a full-blown application and you're trying to build like a new time management system, you're trying to build all this big thing, and you need navigation and all this other stuff, and data binding is just one piece of your app, that's where Angular comes in. So you don't sit there and look at it and say, should I use Angular or Knockout? When that question comes up, I'm like, you need to use Knockout because apparently you don't need all this other stuff. You just need data binding. Okay? So think about it like that. Now, let me take one little tangent real quick, and then we're going to dive into Lotso demo. Have anybody that is, you might not, a lot of people aren't using Angular, or some people aren't using Angular, or even got scared late last year when they saw the Angular team come out and say, hey, Angular 2 is coming out, we're going to work on that, and everything's changing, and we have all these tombstones of all these features that we're using that are all going to be dead. And everyone's like, I've got to rewrite my entire app. You are out your mind, right? Let me give it to you straight how it is, okay? So in March, Google clarified what they were doing with Angular. They finally clarified what was going on, or they did it in a very good way. They had done a couple podcasts and blog posts up to that, but at a conference in March in Salt Lake called NGConf, which is the Angular conference in North America, they had a couple keynotes explaining what they were doing, what their intentions were. Where are we? Today, we're on Angular 1.3. So if you ask any of the guys on the Angular team, they say, which version should I use if I'm building a brand new app? They say 1.3. 1.4 is currently in release candidate. I think it's on RC1. Angular 1.4 is the next version that we'll be looking at. And it's got a lot of performance stuff, but the big things it's got are a lot of improvements to the animation stuff that it's done, and a whole new router, whole new navigation router that's a lot better. Actually, the navigation router is the one that they built for 2.0. They just backported it to 1.4. What they've said is that future versions of the 1.x branch, 1.5, 1.6, those have a primary goal of helping you, when you build your apps, to be able to migrate them to 2.0 in a much easier way. So the primary goal of the 1.5 and forward versions will be to help you migrate to 2.0. 2.0, they don't know when that's coming out, all right? They haven't said when it's coming out. They've given a couple hints. To me, it smells like around 4, 6-ish months, maybe something like that. We should know more in May or June. They said that they're going to go to a very big application inside Google, and they're going to port it to 2.0, and that will tell them essentially where they are, how much work they need, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So we'll see where you are. To me, I would focus on 1.3 or 1.4. Trying to do stuff with 2.0 right now is an absolute, it's very challenging because you're still pulling together a lot of different things. It is incredibly fast. The performance is absolutely amazing, but keep this in mind. It is only going to be supported in evergreen browsers. That means Chrome, Firefox. That means the new Microsoft browser. It used to be called Project Spartan. Now it's called Edge, I think, right? Man, another blue E. And then IE 11, right? So, got a couple customers that might not be up to speed. You might still be using a more legacy version of IE that won't be able to use Angular 2. So keep that in mind. Now, I've got if you're interested, I got a blog post up that I put up in the last 2 weeks that explains how you should think about it, why there's an advantage to it. It really is going to be a really good improvement going forward. But here's the way I look at it, because a lot of people complain about it. Let's draw an analogy here. Years ago, we did not have something called ASP.NET MVC. We had ASP.NET Web Forms. We didn't know that there was anything wrong with them. We loved them. They were great. Some of the enlightened ones could tell that there were other platforms that were out there that had this stuff called MVC. And the more we saw it, the more we're like, oh, that stuff does look better. So Microsoft came out and said, now we got a new thing called ASP.NET MVC. They couldn't go through and just port web forms to MVC because we had a whole bunch of paradigms that had to change, right? So we went through and we just said, they just had a whole new version. Were there people that complained, God, I got to rewrite my entire application from web forms to MVC? Sure. Are there web forms applications still today? Yes. Are they running just fine? Yes. Here's the cool thing. What Google has said, I look at it the same way. Web forms, that's version 1.x. MVC, it's version Angular 2.0 or 2. Whatever forward. All right? Here's the way I look at it, right? Or here's what Google's doing. This is a cool thing too. I wish all software companies would do this. AngularJS.org is where Angular 1.x lives. HTTP Angular.io is where Angular 2 lives. They're going to watch the traffic, and they're going to watch the pulls from the different CDNs, and they're going to watch the activity in GitHub. And when the majority of the people, the vast majority of the people, have started to switch from 1 to 2, then that's when they'll stop doing work on 1.x. But they will continue to do work on both versions of it. So if you're sitting there wondering, oh my God, I'm going to get abandoned, I'm going to get messed over and everything, I don't see that at all. They're going to let us decide when we retire the old version. When's the last time you heard that from a software company? That's pretty cool. I like that approach. Okay, too many slides. How about some demos? All right, so I got 3 demos here. Let me switch over my machine. It makes it a little bit easier to show them. All right. So I have 3 different demos here that I'm going to show you. So let me show you the first one. I'll show you the first one running, and then we'll kind of dig into it a little bit. So I'm going to hold off on doing all the gulp stuff and the build process and everything till the very end. If we have a little bit of time for that, let's see some of these different samples first. So this first one is an Outlook add-in for Office. And so what this one's going to do is that I have a concept of where I want to take. I want to look at all the words in an email address, in the body of an email, and wherever I see something that's a potential person's last name. So where the word has separated by spaces on either side and it's got a capital first letter, generally speaking, that's I know it's not getting everybody, but that's generally speaking that's a good way of finding names in an email. Okay, I'm going to find a lot more stuff. What I want to do is in that email find all those words, submit them over to my CRM system see if those are candidates of my current customers, and if they are, I want you to be able to light up a little add-in inside of my Outlook email that I'm looking at, and it shows me the different people that I can click on. Just like in Outlook, we have one of those things for LinkedIn. I'd like to have one of those, but talks to my CRM system. So this is going to show an Office add-in. It's going to show Angular and a Node.js site that's going to serve as a RESTful proxy. Now, I'll explain why I have to do that. So before I get going on this, I actually have to compile all my TypeScript to JavaScript. So there's one. We'll do the same thing for my client stuff. And then I'm also going to say, oh, I don't want to do that. Yeah, that's good how it is. Now let's go through and fire this guy up. So I'll say node src server server.js. That's where the JavaScript file is. And so now I have a web server that's listening on port 8843. Now that's good because if I come over here to my my Outlook web access, my Outlook app, and I go log in to my tenant, let's go into incognito mode. Useful for hiding cookies and all that stuff, and another thing that we won't talk about. So let's come over here to banking. Banking. That's what I meant. Right. Andrew Connell, ACI 036503.onmicrosoft.com. And then I'll see welcome $1. There we go. Oh, I didn't like that. What don't you like? That's not 0, it's an O. What was it again? $1. Now I got a nice little scare this morning. I'm getting ready to do my demo. What happens? I get this email. You have 1 day until your tenant expires. I'm like, when did that come in? It's like, do I have a full day? And all the session was going like this, and I was talking to the 365 guys. They said, we want you to repeat the session tomorrow. I'm like, oh. Can't do that. Not ready. So here's what this one's going to do. This one is going to look at, like, let's just say this email. And I know the text is super small. That's not important. Let's see if I make that's not going to help. It's an HTML email, so actually the font is supposed to be there. But the font is kind of set. But look just above the body of the email and below the name. See where I have this thing here that says customer lookup. Now, when I click this, what's going to happen behind the scenes, let's see if I can show this at the same time. Come over here, come over here. Watch over here. What you're going to see is over on the node side, I'm going to write out the request I'm going to make to my CRM system. Now, I'm cheating a little bit here because what I'm actually doing is I'm calling a sample RESTful OData service at the odata.org website. Now, the reason I have to have a Node.js site running for this is because that sample web service is HTTP. All right? Office apps or Office add-ins all run as websites, and those websites have to be at an HTTPS endpoint. If I want to make a call out to that other web service and over HTTP, every browser is going to block that request because I'm in a secure environment switching over to an unsecure environment. So I need a server-side proxy to go do that for me. That's what my Node.js site is going to be doing that we'll look at in a half second. So I come over here, click on Customer Lookup, and what it just did, you see over there in the console, it just sent a bunch of information over here on the left-hand side back, or made a request out to the odata.org Northwind website and pulled out all the different matches that it found. And in this point, it only found Pascal. This thing that's running right here, that's my Node.js website that's running on my laptop, and it's running it's an Angular application that's using the Google design language, Material Design. So I've got these cool little things popping up like this. I click on it, nice little transition back and forth. You saw I got the detail. It's kind of hard to see what's going on over here, but you can tell that there's work going on. Back and forth. I go over to this email right here, go to Customer Lookup, and I got 2 people that show up this time. I got Maria, John Doe, and Anna, and John Doe's not in here, so I only see 2 people showing up. Okay? So that's all done in Node. So how does that actually work? Let's kill this guy, and then I'll come over here and we'll kill this process. So how does this work? Well, over here in my project here, underneath this Node 0365, no, wait, is that it? Hold on, Outlook, this one. I come over here, and inside of server, I'm going to show you the TypeScript and not the JavaScript. You guys in the back, can you see it okay? Is that too small? Is it good? Yes, it's good. I love it. You get thumbs up. It's like, bump the font up. No, it's good. I'm like, which one is it? I'm like, it's okay. I'm like, there's a big light. I can't see that. Okay, so they say it's good. So here's like I'm standing up a simple website. Now this is like super, super simple, okay? So here's what I'm doing. Up at the very top here, I'm doing a bunch of imports and adding reference, doing a bunch of require statements. For those of you .NET guys, what is this? This is kind of like namespace references. I'm importing different things into this file, okay? Or like the using statements we have at the very top. Let's create an instance of our Express web server. And then I'm going to go say to the handlebars piece, I'm going to say, where are all of your partial views? They're in a subfolder within the current location of where the application is running in the /views folder, and you see that right over here. I'll show you that in a second. I'm going to then tell Express that the view engine he's going to use is handlebars, or HBS, and I'm also going to tell him where all his views are. Right? Just kind of have to say it twice. Next up, I'm going to set a bunch of static routes. So when you go to /public, that's really going to map to something, a folder called public. Right? When you go to public/vendor, that's going to map to a folder over here called Bower components. Bower is another packaging system, because we need yet another one, that's good for client-side libraries. So we use NuGet for everything in .NET. What you're seeing is in Visual Studio 2015, they're adding support for things like Bower and Gulp and Grunt and NPM and all that stuff right inside of Visual Studio 2015, because they see that's where a big community of open source developers is working. Scroll down a little bit farther. This is where it's going to load my controllers and go and initialize them. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then I need to be able to stand up an HTTPS site. So that I'm doing here is I'm creating some configuration stuff, loading in a public and a private cert, and then I'm starting up the server on line 39 by saying HTTPS, create server, here's the options, here's the port, and I want you, or here's the app, the Express site, and then I'm going to say .listen, and that's going to listen on a specific port. Now, that part right there that you see about me doing the stuff with the certificates, if you've never worked on OS X, on a Mac, you have no idea how nice it is in Visual Studio that when you first installed Visual Studio the very first time on your machine, and you went to go run a website, and you told that you wanted HTTPS, and it asked you, do you want me to go create a self-signed cert and have your machine trust it so it can work? Have you guys seen that before? Holy crap, you have no idea how big that yes button really is on your screen. The GitHub repo that you guys can take a look at here, you can see how much work it was to get this thing actually running. I think, yeah, it's right down here, the self-signed cert. Let me scroll to the bottom here. You can't make this stuff up. There's actually a part where you go in and it says, when you get to the dialog that comes up, click Always Trust. And then after you do that, after the localhost thing shows up, you then save it, come right back into the exact same thing you said always trust, and then say always trust it again, because the first time didn't really trust it, all of it. It just charged some of it. And I'm like, man, I love my MacBook Pro, but I'm like, what, really? Who's the guy that made that decision, right? So I don't know. Anyway, so I can't tell you how much of a big deal that is. So now we got a web server that's running. Well, let's come back over here and let's look at our controllers, how everything got loaded up. Over here on my controllers part, I have an index.ts. So the way it works with Node is that if you look up here at the top, I've got my controller factory, and notice I'm pointing to ./controllers/index. That's looking for a JavaScript file called index.js. So here's the TypeScript equivalent of it. I'm pulling in a home controller, an API controller, and then I'm creating a class. Now, I love using TypeScript because as somebody who's traditionally a server-side developer with strong typing, I had a little hard time moving over to the JavaScript world initially. Let me ask you guys this. I love asking this question when I do sessions like this. How many of you consider yourselves strong JavaScript developers? I mean, another question coming in a second, so be honest. How many of you consider yourselves strong JavaScript developers? Okay. How many of you put yourself in the same bucket that I put myself, which is, I've just been hacking my way through this JavaScript thing for the last decade. I see a cool drop down on a site, view source, pull that thing down, put it in. It's not working. Let's add some alerts, right? You laugh because you've been there. All right, so anyway, so I really like TypeScript because it allows me to write the C# style code, the strongly typing code that I'm used to writing, classes, IntelliSense, and all that stuff. I like writing it that way. So if you're not familiar with TypeScript, you can at least follow along what the code's doing. It compiles down to JavaScript. It's like, what does it look like? It looks like that. Oh, okay. So right here, I have an init function on my controller, and you saw where I called, after I created the controllers in that server.ts file, I then said controllerfactory.init. What that did is that created two instances of the home controller and the API controller. The home controller doesn't really do anything, but you can see what the routes look like. Let's jump over to the one that actually has some logic in it, the API controller. What this guy does right here, it shows a little red squiggly. It's a good thing the thing actually ran. So over here, I have my API controller. I have a constructor that's getting passed in the Express web application. I'm going to call load routes. What load routes is going to do is it's going to define a couple different routes. If I go to /API/customer/lookup by name, and I pass in some list of names, it's going to call this function right here. And if I scroll down to that, here's the function right here. That text is big enough, isn't it? You guys, it is okay, right, in the way back? Bigger? Somebody yell out, please. Bigger. Oh, thank you. Better? Uh-oh. Everybody okay? There. Is that good? Okay, thank you. There. So what this guy's going to do here is that he's going to go in. He's going to split up all the stuff. Classic, I pass everything in as a CSV. I'm going to run through all of that. I'm building up an OData query for the filter. Here I'm going to build the query. There's the endpoint we're going to do. Go to this Northwind service, select these different fields. There's the filter I'm going to add, creating my HTTP request options. Then I'm going to make the request. This is kind of freaky here. There's a library called request or a package called request. So you make a request using the request library, right? I could have named it something better. But anyway, you call request. You pass in where are you going, what options you want to pass in, and then here's the callback. If there's an error, pass in the error. If there's a response, pass in the response. If there's a body, pass in the body. And in there, I just take the body and I look at the exp response. That's the express response object. I just say send back the body I got from the Northwind web service. Send that REST response right on back to the Angular application. Okay? So now you've seen how to go through and how to use Node.js to build an Angular app, or to build an Angular like REST API. But you also have we also have this thing for doing, where is it? Is that it? No, not app. Oh, we also had views, because in my views, remember, when my app loads, I need to be able to load an Angular application. So when I went to, where's my controller for home? If you remember, if I just go to /, then that's going to do a response.render, passing in the view home/index, and I can pass in an object that is essentially my view model that'll get bound to the view. That's going to look inside the views folder, because remember I told you that's where my partial views were. The layout.hbs is kind of like your shared layout that you have in ASP.NET MVC or your master page, and the body of my page is going to go right there. That's where the view is actually going to get injected. All right? If I go look at this view right here, all I'm doing is just adding in a div that's got the Angular view directive where my actual code is going to get injected into. I say I want to do a nice little shuffle animation. That's how I'm getting the cool little transitions going. And then I'm loading up all the code related to my application. All right? Now, I'm not going to try and teach Angular here. It's going to be a bit of a fire hose, just like I'm trying to teach in like Node.js. I want to get you just to kind of whet your appetite and see if you might be interested in learning more about this. I got some links at the end. So my app is going to load. Now, one thing, for those of you who have done Angular applications, you're noticing one thing that's missing right here on the screen. It's on line 27. With this, you usually have a directive on here to tell Angular where would the load actually initialize, or where would it be bound to. And it would say something like data-ng-app equals, and then it would be the name of your app. I don't have that. Why? When you're working with Office add-ins, there's a JavaScript file that you reference. That JavaScript file comes from Microsoft, or comes from 365, called Office.js. And it does all the communication between the hosting app and the child app, so that we can actually read the body of the email, or we can put some stuff in the content in the body of the email. Or if it's Word, we can write to the document or read what's selected. Or if it's Excel, we can do those. We can read and write to the different cells. That's all done by Office.js. Well, there's a little trick with Office.js. It's one of the rules that Microsoft tells you. Over here in the module, one of the things that you do, let me scroll down here. There's a function down here called initialize, and it's coming from the Office object that is defined by Office.js. The rules state that you have to call, that you have to have a function called initialize, and it has to be called within 5 seconds of creating the Office add-in. If it's not there, then what happens is that the hosting Office app shows a nice little friendly yellow error message that says the app is not available right now. So your customer doesn't feel like nothing's happening. They know that the app broke, but they at least don't have they're not waiting around for something to happen. If that's not there, now that initialize function is not there, but it's called by Office.js within 5 seconds. And if it's not there after 5 seconds, it throws the error. So your job is to put it in there. And here's the trick. Angular, when it does its binding of the app to the page, it clobbers Office.js, and Office.js also clobbers Angular. So I don't have a data-ng-app directive. Instead, I tell Office to initialize, and then I do the same bootstrapping of my Angular app, but I do it programmatically by saying angular.bootstrap, go find an element on the page called container, and bound the app called Outlook app. You saw in my view, clicking too much, where is it? Here. There's container right there. Okay? So you see how the app is actually getting rendered there. Now, instead of showing you all the Angular stuff in this guy and how this guy works, let me jump to another demo because the last demo I have is much more Angular-ish. So let me jump to the next one to kind of show you a little something else that you can do with this. Let's see. So it's not running. That one's not running. So which one am I in? Am I in the right spot? This one's going to be web. Okay. So for those of you who were in my theater talk where I showed how to get Node running on a Raspberry Pi, this is the website that we actually ran. So again, let me come back over here to my terminal window, and let me do gulp compile server TypeScript and gulp compile client TypeScript. Is it not in there? Oh, no, there is none. That's right, because this is only a server-side app. Okay, so in this one, this is basically the same thing that we just looked at a second ago. The difference, though, is that what's special about this application is that this one is going to require us to use Azure AD to log in to our application to talk to Office 365 APIs. So let's go run this guy. So I'll do node src server.js. He's going to fire up on port 8000. And let's not use that one. Let's use that one. And go to HTTP localhost 3000. And here's the same application that you saw in my theater talk to where I can go through it and click around to this guy. If I click on the home, let's just put this over here. I don't need all this real estate. Let's move that all the way over. I can go to home. You can see the requests are getting logged over here. If I click login, that's going to take me to Azure AD to log in. So I come over here, click through this. Welcome, $1. We're having trouble signing you in. Oh, yeah, it does. Okay. Here's my password, right? Huh. That was really dumb. Why? Hold on. Reply address 8 auth doesn't match this. Yes, it does. Oh, let's come back over here. Let's go to manage. So this is the thing. You get these error messages like, sorry, we're having trouble signing you in, which is like, oh, that's just like that much better than a correlation ID, right, in SharePoint. Like, oh, you Azure guys, at least you didn't show me the ID. No, anyway. But if I scroll down here and look at the bottom, it actually tells me exactly what the problem is. It says the reply address of this does not match the reply address configured in the application. Oh, wait a minute. So if I go over here to manage to my Azure Management Portal, and we watch the spinner, this makes it goes faster. Go. Come on. Man, you want your press time today, don't you? 15 minutes of fame. Where is it? This is going to be this guy, and I bet you, oh, look at that, I'm going to an IP address, because that's the IP address of my Raspberry Pi. So let's switch it out, and this will be localhost, :8000, and then the reply address will be localhost 8000, and I'll hit save. What? Wait, what? It's 3,000. There's 3,000. There's 3,000. I said 8,000. Do as I do. Don't do as I say. Yep, you are paying attention. I appreciate that. Looking out for me. I need it. All right, so let's back up again. Let's go log in. Oh, and now I'm logged in. So now the reason I did that is because I was logged in over here. So let's sign out. Come back in, and now let's log back in. Ta-da. Well, it's okay. You got my password. It expires tomorrow, so good luck. Anyway, so There's no data in there. It's just demo stuff. This is my last session, so I'm good. Have fun with the demos. So this guy here, I log in. I go to the Discovery service. I can view all the stuff coming from the Discovery service. There's all the things coming from. These are live Office 365 API Discovery service calls. I go back to the Discovery service. This one showed everything. Didn't need any authentication. But over here, this request to see all the services that I have access to, this one needed authentication to show me all the different services that my app had been granted access to. And if you notice, it's noticed that it did not have a credential in the session cache, meaning it didn't have an access token for the Discovery service before it made the request. So it sent me over to the login page, which redirected me to Azure AD. Azure AD, I was still authenticated, and it says, oh, I'll give you an access token for that resource. You have permissions to it. Redirected back to my /auth page on my application, which handled getting the key or the access token and saving it. And then it redirected me back to my services page, which found the credential right here in session cache. The reason why it comes after is because the log messages happen when the page gets rendered. And before the page was rendered, I was looking for the credential. OK, so how does all that stuff work? How does the authentication stuff work? So let's come back over here to our application. And you've seen how, like a Node.js site, you've seen some stuff. There's some things in here that are kind of interesting where I'm using sessions and then I'm storing all the session values on the file system. So over here, there's a folder called sessions, and now you can see there's the access token for the Azure AD graph. Here's the one for the Discovery service that we just got, and here's my access token. So there's a password you can write down real quick if you want to. So if I come back over here, how is that happening? So I have a controller here called auth controller. And inside of the auth folder, I've also got a thing called Azure AD. So Azure AD has a class inside of it. And this class knows how to go through and build up things like, what endpoint do I use to go get an authorization code? What endpoint do I use to go take the code that I got back from that authorization code request to get an access token? So I need to go do all of that kind of stuff. So that's just basically a utility class. The big thing, the important part, is down here in the auth controller. Inside this auth controller, this is the one that's mapping to the /auth on my site. So here, I've got a login, I've got an auth, and I've got a log out. So what happens on login? It has handle login get. What does that guy do? He creates an instance of that guy. He goes and builds up the endpoint. He's going to, let's see, he saves the state because you put a state value on the query string. And what that does is that when you actually go to authenticate with Azure, the state goes with the request. And when it comes back around, back to your application, the same state is included in the post that you get from Azure. So you can compare what you sent Azure and what you got back to protect against cross-site request forgery requests. Whatever that is, it protects against that one little, that somebody didn't try and hack your site. That the request is coming back from a process you started. This thing right here, I'm just checking to see on the query string if there's a value called redir. And if there is, then I know that once they authenticate, send them directly to another page. You saw that when I got the My Services page to see a list of all the services that the Discovery service says that I have access to. Okay? So he goes through, saves that in a cookie, saves the resource ID, and then he redirects me over to Azure. Now, handle the auth get. This is the request that comes back from Azure. So here I'm checking to see, is the state that we saved in our cookie that we sent Azure the same as the one that Azure sent us back? And if it isn't, then we say there's a possible CSFR. If anybody wants to help, it's an open source project, so go ahead and jump in. Right? So over here, let's build up the authority and get the context. If you've done anything with ADAL, the ADAL library from the Azure AD team, where you can go through and do all the authentication with Azure AD, there's a Node version of it that I'm using here. So up here, you'll see I'm actually importing in ADAL Node that the Azure AD team has created and provides as a Node package. That's for doing Azure Active Directory authentication in Node. There's another option that some of you that have done Node before called Passport. It's a very extensible authentication library and stack that you can take advantage of. They also have support for that as well. I find that to be a little more cumbersome or a lot more work to actually get running. The ADAL-Node package to me is a lot easier to use. So I use that one. And plus, it kind of goes more with ADAL. So I'm getting things like authentication context, and you've seen from some of the other demos this week, or if you've been doing stuff with the Office 365 APIs, you've seen code that shows using an authentication context. So let me jump back down to line 79 where I was. We create an authentication context, and then I'm going to come down here and get the resource ID. That config.get is looking at a configuration file in my project to find out what's the resource ID for the discovery service, what's the resource ID for the Graph API, stuff like that. A little bit farther down, now what I'm doing is I'm saying auth context, the thing that Azure gave me, call this function, acquire token with authorization code. I pass in the authorization code that I got back from Azure, and then I pass in things like where are you supposed to go when you authenticate. I pass in the resource ID for the discovery service. I pass in the ID of my Azure AD application. I pass in the secret for my Azure AD application. What that does on my behalf is makes the request to the Azure AD token endpoint to go get an access token for the resource that I needed. And when I come back, I'm just going to take that value and, where do I do it? I'm then going through and I'm going to save it in a session variable or in my session state. So that's how I'm doing the authentication. You've seen how to go through and do REST API stuff, or there's other, I haven't shown it to you, but there's other demos that other people are doing this week. Like there was one that Rob Howard did this morning on deep dive with the REST API and using the discovery service. I'd encourage you to go take a look at that video if you didn't see that session on how to use the REST API to query the discovery service. But instead of showing that code, now that I've shown you how to do Azure AD with Node and Office 365 APIs, and in the last sample we saw how to do Angular, a little bit of Angular stuff with an Outlook add-in. In the 8 or so minutes I have left, I want to show you one more sample. I want to show you one more sample for another application. So let me open up this guy. And let's go back over to this, and let's stop the web server. Oh, he did stop. And let me go ahead and get him running. Gulp, compile, TS. And then I'm using for this one, this is a 100% static website, CSS, HTML, JavaScript, all of it runs in the client. I have a Node package installed globally on my machine called Superstatic, which just runs a static website. So I'm going to type in Superstatic port. Which port do I use here? I'm going to use 8000. Port 8000. There you go. So now the Superstatic site is started. Now I'm going to take this guy. Let's come over here, copy this URL, go back to my browser, and, oh, darn it. Will you do that? No, it's still not running. So it's going to try and automatically log me in. Let's back up a little bit. OK, so when I click login, I'm still logged into Azure right now, so when I click login, it's going to be pretty quick a round trip coming around because it thinks I'm still logged in, which is fine. So I click login, goes back and forth to Azure, and now I'm pulling data from a SharePoint list using the REST API, and I can come over here and look at myself and my expenses. I've got a few expenses over here, and let's go through and click on this plus to open this up. This little spinner right here is talking to the Office 365 Files API, which the first time you call it can take a few seconds for it to get going. So we wait for a second, twiddle our thumbs, tell it that, hey, remember, we've only got about 6 minutes left of the demo here, so let's get going. You're not doing it. Trust me, it works. I refresh it, come back over here. I'm impatient. Click on this. You go faster this time because I want to click this drop-down and see attachments coming from my OneDrive for Business site inside of Office 365. This thing runs 100% client-side. So what is it doing? It's taking advantage of a couple other technologies that Office 365 gives us and the Azure AD guys give us. So let's kill this guy. Let's go look at the code. Whoa, that's small code. How's that? Is that good for you guys in the back? Yep. OK. So this guy over here, let me show you the cool part of this stuff. So this, again, this is an Angular application written in TypeScript. In the link I'll give you, at the end, this is one that I built for Microsoft, and there's a hands-on lab that walks you through getting this thing up and running. But let me show you the really cool part about this. So, a gentleman asked me before the session, I need to go through and do 100% client-side secure application and have everything be nice and secure. I'm like, yes. He goes, can you give me a pointer to that? I'm like, yes, wait till the last demo. So I lucked out on this one. Hopefully we can, this will work well. Well, it did work well. You saw it. So here, I'm building an Angular app. It's called Expense App. And I'm passing in a bunch of different routes. And I'm also passing in, I'm going in and configuring the application. So I'm defining this method called configure. Here, I'm going to go in and define all the routes of where my application can go. Now, I'm going to come back to that one in just a minute. But let's look at this one first. expenseapp.adal.configure. This is showing off one of the coolest technologies that Microsoft has created in a while. What is that doing? There is now support for the implicit OAuth flow for authentication in Azure AD. What is that? The biggest thing that we had to do when we were doing authentication is that we had to protect the secret part of our application. If it's the authorization code, we got to protect the client secret. If we're using the authorization code flow for Azure AD, we have to protect the secret. If we're using the client credentials flow, we have to protect the certificate. That's how we do app only with Azure AD. The third one was, how do we do this using the implicit flow? When we don't want to use a secret, we just want to use the ID. This is how it works. I set up adlprovider.init. I pass in the tenant ID, which is the ID of my Azure AD tenant. I pass in the client ID of my application. I pass out. As fast as I'm talking right now, I'm going to pass out. I pass in the URL of where I want to go once the application is done, when you log out, and then I pass in a list of endpoints. And when I pass those things in, the Angular HTTP provider is now going to be wired up by AngularJS to look for things and say, hey, whenever you go to one of these endpoints right here, or you go to an endpoint right here, AngularJS says, you need to be authenticated. And if you're not already authenticated, I'm going to send you over to Azure to go authenticate. You're going to go authenticate, you're going to get an access token, and you're going to get it back. When you get that access token back, I'm then going to issue a request that you had for one of those two endpoints. And because you've listed it right here, I'm going to automatically put an authorization header with the value of bearer space access token to secure the request going over to the Azure AD, the resource or the endpoint that we're talking to. The first one being the SharePoint REST API. The second one being the Files API. That's really freaking cool. When this thing released, there's a blog post up on the Azure AD team where they said, hey, it went GA. I worked with a guy named Dan Wallin in testing this stuff and getting it working. This literally takes about 2.5 minutes to get added to your Angular app. Okay? You can even come over here into your routes and just say, this route needs to be secured by just saying, require AD login equals true. If you don't set that, it equals false. We set this whole thing up, and we literally are looking at each other like, did that really just work? That was way too easy to get that working, and it just worked. Absolutely awesome. This is what Rob Howard was talking about this morning when he said he just wanted to grab Vittorio and give him a kiss. He couldn't because I was up first, right? It was so freaking cool, right? So I'm kind of running out of time here. I really wanted to show more of this application, but there's a video up on Channel 9, there's a video up on the training content for the dev.office.com. Look for the expense manager, and if you're interested in looking at the hands-on lab, I'll show you a link to that in a half a second here. So I wanted to show you a couple different things using different technologies that you can take advantage of. We saw a little bit of Angular, a very little bit. We saw a lot of Node.js. We saw some ADAL.js. So let me switch back to the slides. I know that there are people in here that looked at this and are like, what in the heck did I just... You ever sit through a dev session and like you hear people start clapping at the end and you're kind of sitting there like, what the hell just happened? Or you kind of look like that dude up there, right? Right? Hey, what the heck? Right? That's okay. The idea is that you just got some ideas about how you can do this different stuff. I didn't show you everything. I wasn't trying to. The idea was just showing, oh God, I love the picture. I gotta make it a video. So I didn't show you the whole thing, soup to nuts on all these different projects, but check it out. Down at the bottom there, all the demos that I just ran are all down there. You can go grab them from GitHub. The first link, called Pres O365 Node, that contains the first 2 demos. You'll see 2 folders in there. You're going to grab those 2 folders. That's the one that contains the one for the Node O365 Web, which is the Raspberry Pi demo I ran earlier today, and the one that we ran, the second demo we ran in this session. And then it also has the other piece for doing the website that Azure AD login using ADAL-node and talk to the discovery service. The second one there, that points to a repository that contains the last sample I did and pointed to the hands-on lab where you can get some work done and trying out building that last sample that I showed. And then finally, all those other links there are there for you guys to take a look at these different technologies. The last thing I just want to throw out there too, please make sure you go fill out an evaluation here. Let them know if you like this session. Let them know if I shouldn't be invited back or if you want to see something different. I really appreciate you guys sticking around. Sorry everybody was so tight in here, but hope you learned something and got something out of this session. So thanks a lot and enjoy the show.